Good afternoon, and thanks for being here, everybody. I'm Andrea Jain, and I am coordinating this year for some of the episodes of the Religion and series for the Center for the Study of Religion in American Culture. Welcome to the third season of the Center's Religion and series. The first season and the second seasons were dynamic and provocative and really successful. And the goal of this series is to create a space for thoughtful and engaged conversation at the intersection of religion and American studies. The center feels that in these times more than ever, we need safe harbors to engage and unpack questions about the relationship between cultural transformation in North America and the category of religion. For the last 33 years, the center, its journal, the Young Scholars Program have been just that. It's brought together scholars and practitioners to engage religion and its relationship to the most important questions in our field and on our campuses and throughout society. So Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and thinkers in multiple fields hosted by the center to continue these critically important interventions. Every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we will discuss a topic that looks at the relationship between religion, the pressing issues of our day, and their impact on the fields we study. So today, we are here to discuss religion and machines. This episode addresses the idea of the human as it is intertwined with issues of anthropogenic exploitation of and extraction from the planet, and complicated by relationships with machines. The voices in this episode explore developments in technology and in American fields of transhumanism and Afrofuturism, with the aim of bringing to the fore the ethical, political, and religious implications of the relationality of the human, the machine, and the environment. So I'm going to introduce our panelists real quick, and then I'll open it up for them to discuss this topic. I'm going to start with Jacob Boss. Jacob is a doctoral candidate in religious studies at Indiana University. Joy Bostic is an associate professor of religious studies at Case Western Reserve University. And Michael Hemenway is the Director of Design and Data Science at the Association of Theological Schools and Research Associate as well at H-Lab at Case Western University. So I want to open it up now to our panelists, and I'll start with just a real broad question for you all to reflect on or respond to, and that is, why should we be thinking about humans' relationships to machines at this time of anthropogenic change? At this time of planetary crisis in particular, how does your work address the question of the human relationship with machines at this particular moment in history?
I'm happy to jump in and see what comes up, if that's all right with the panel. Yeah, all right. Okay, so what I'm thinking about in my work is how by tracing networks of dependencies, we find these layouts, these structures, where there are identifiable places where the distribution of technology and resources is obviously inequitable. And then there are communities that spring up to try to correct for those obvious inequities. By tracing those patterns, my work took me to organizations and people involved in community medicine, different kinds of community protection and creation, where they use technology to make up for inadequacies, unequal distribution, and exploitation. So just to give you an example, I was at a demonstration in Pittsburgh a few years ago where an anarchist technology group was teaching their community how to manufacture birth control in a community or a home lab situation, anticipating a near future where the restriction of birth control would be inevitable. And so we actually watched as various processes were undertaken to produce birth control tablets. And then people could learn in how to reproduce these results in community lab situations. So we learn what communities are anticipating in the near future and the steps that they are taking in order to meet those predicted futures and the technologies that they're using in order to address their perceived and lived inequities. That's what comes to mind first off.
I'm going to jump in real quick and just say I forgot to mention that if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end. But please put them there in the Q&A, and then we'll read from them at the end. So I'm wondering if Michael or Joy have anything else to offer on this issue around inequitable, the inequitable effects of planetary change and climate change in particular, and how you might see that result in different communities relating to technology or to machines differently, depending on their perceived vulnerability in light of climate change. Is that a question that has come up for either of you?
Well, I might, to that point, you know, there's a way, so it's becoming well known, right, that AI technologies are pretty hard on the environment, right? So one form of the kind of growing inequity I can imagine is that those with access to AI, right, or more access to using AI tools are continuing then to propagate these environmental problems without being conscious of those. So I love, Jacob, the work you're doing, and that those communities are trying to find ways to find different kinds of agency around technology, right, that may be less extractive than just using the newest, biggest, fastest AI technologies unawares of the damage it might be doing. But my hunch is that inequity is getting, you know, propagated because they're you know, the access to AI is already inequitable, and so, you know, we're consolidating the damage done to the environment into groups that are going to be least impacted by that, right? Because they already have the sort of privilege. So it's a vicious cycle, right?
Yes, I think that in terms of thinking about technology such as artificial intelligence, that we can look at sort of the historical way in which marginalized communities have both been rendered invisible, but also become hypervisible in ways that amplify and deepen inequities and violation and surveillance, et cetera. And so we know issues around AI in terms of, you know, we're going through the airports, facial recognition. I was just in a cab with someone who saying that makes us safer. I said, but, you know, as they were sort of thumping hip hop music, this is a non-Black person thumping Black hip hop music, but, you know, facial recognition in terms of identifying darker skinned people becomes a problem. And so who becomes detained or surveilled more deeply because of those inequities and that invisibility in terms of the development of the technology, but the hypervisibility in terms of that technology surveilling and identifying them in spaces where they become detained, targeted, et cetera. And so thinking about religion and machines in particular, it's important, sort of my coming from the standpoint of Africana studies and looking at Black communities, is thinking about the ways in which Black people themselves, darker skinned people themselves, have been looked upon as non-human. And sort of what does that mean in terms of the ways in which exploitation, targeting, et cetera, impacts how we consider the non-human within a context where Western Christianity in particular sets up these dichotomies and hierarchies of being and meaning. And the other piece of that, however, is sort of how are we looking at religious traditions that are indigenous to various parts of the global South and the African continent, but within Africana studies, the Americas as well, that already have these worldviews and constructs that are deeply embodied. And the point of technology, both organic and inorganic in these worldviews or systems, is efficacy. But it's not an efficacy that's based on exploitation. It's an efficacy based on how effective is it at connecting people within communities, people to the past, to the living and the dead and the yet born. And so within these religious traditions, technologies are used as a way to establish communal equilibrium, to repair and to heal, and to create sort of new community and a more empowered community. And so I think thinking about religion and ethics and theological praxis in that sense is also important for how we draw upon various religious traditions and concepts in terms of how we think about our responses to the technology as it develops.
Joy, I love that. I love the efficacy as a contrast to the efficiency, right? Mm-hmm. That is often the driving force of technologies happening, at least in most capitalist kind of driven communities. Mm-hmm. And so that's a really beautiful example of alternative ways of relating to technology, not just getting rid of it, right? But embracing it and embodying it in ways that aren't just driven by efficiency. It seems to me that's a crucial question for us moving into the future.
Mm-hmm. So to clarify, Joy, are you saying that there are traditional models of human relationships with machines that we could draw on from particular religious traditions that could be helpful for us in imagining better ways of relating?
Well, I think, they're certainly within Afrofuturist literature and sort of how Afrofuturists and various and African futurists, Andrea Kofor is for one, she talks about herself as an African futurist, but other intellectuals who are thinking about technology. That's why I said technology, broadly speaking, that runs across the organic and the inorganic. And so sort of how you think about the technology of hair and sort of the use of organic materials in terms of hair and I'm forgetting the name of her novel now, but and how that becomes fused with technology and machines is a way in which Afrofuturists and African futurists are imagining different futures in which sort of Black empowerment and embodiment becomes linked. But the underlying sort of worldview and what I call social sacred worldview is the ways in which Jacob sort of talked about interdependency, interconnectedness. And I think that's fundamentally what we continue to lose is the ways in which we're interconnected. And as Michael and Jacob talk about the inequities within community where the privileged don't immediately feel the effect or the impact. The reality is that we're all impacted because we're all linked. And of course, people who are marginalized and less privileged bear the brunt, particularly early on in that. So I'm looking at these systems in terms of an Afrofuturist who are sort of imagining not only futures, but reimagining pasts in ways that create visibility for darker skinned people, for one, without the problematics of hypervisibility, but center their experience, but also their praxis and ethics of what I call in many of the religious traditions, Ifa, Vodou, et cetera, that have influenced Africana religions in the Americas. The construct which we often sort of think about is I, we. And so I exist as the collective exists. And so understanding that connection is a part of that. And so the connection to animate and inanimate, the connection to organic and inorganic is all a part of that, because all of it exists within the sacred social construct. And your relationship to yourself and to the collective is what binds, what maintains, the equilibrium. And that's the whole goal, is how you continue to maintain that equilibrium, understand that interconnectivity, and how you show up in ways that are ethical, reciprocal, and mutual to sustain that, if that makes sense.
Joy, when you're talking about the encounter you had with conversation around facial recognition and the other person's immediate response to kind of try to defend or justify its importance, it makes me think about how it's all part of one sort of dynamic. And Michael, your point about AI being resource intensive speaks to this as well, which is that the harms of these technologies are being excused through the language or the model of salvation. And this is something that that I see all the time in field work with transhumanist communities, and also, Joy, this tension between, are we doing this for us, or is this good for me? This individualist, collectivist struggle of our own technology, where this idea that AI will save us becomes such a terrible excuse for all kinds of abuses and exploitations. And it's just disturbingly pervasive also. Yeah.
And then Jake, and in part, I mean, it's because we continue, as Michael sort of talked about in terms of the pervasive influence of capitalism, it continues to be based upon a sort of transactional way in which, we think about, sort of who we are and how we relate to one another. And so, and even within, certain religious traditions where that sense of salvation, is really rooted in, my survival, my life, my benefit, and how systems are and sort of those who wield power in ways that continue to impose these, or to continue to produce or repeat this kind of fear based way in which we relate to one another. And so that was evident in that exchange, in that conversation that I had in the cab, where it was this response to, this is going to make me safer. And so not only salvation, but who needs to be sacrificed, right, to make that happen. And that's the whole issue of sort of exploitation and sort of who's human and who's non-human. And then sort of when you sort of think about machines as the non-human in that type of worldview, it's who gets sacrificed, but not only who gets sacrificed, sort of the sense of this is an inorganic, but what does it mean to me? What does it mean for me as a human being that I'm operating in that transactional way in the world? What does it mean for me in terms of my lack of empathy, my lack of understanding of connection, when I'm rooted in that kind of individualistic perspective? Then the machine just becomes another thing that I exploit and use and dominate for my benefit without consciousness and intentionality about the repercussions of what that means for the earth, that holds me, for my neighbors, and for people who I don't see every day, but I see in my imagination, as the ones who are, who I should be afraid of, and who will come for me if I don't adhere to certain beliefs or adhere to certain modalities.
Joy, that's so helpful for me, because it reminds me of one of the challenges I find with technology or machines and our relationship with them is often we reduce our relationship with technology to instrumentality, right? Which is really just a disposition. I think what I'm hearing you both doing is that's a disposition we're doing with others as well, right? Because of this individualistic kind of independent need for, sustaining my life or whatever, we've become entirely instrumental or instrumentalist in how we relate to machines and to other people, particularly those things that we think are other, right? And yet, this is where maybe I'm overly optimistic. I want to believe one of my sort of the ways I think about the best of religion is the encounter with the irreducible, right? Like being constantly confronted with something that I can't instrumentalize entirely, or I can't systematize, and that is constantly resisting and kind of opening more. And could that kind of notion of religion in relationship with our encounters, at least I have experienced some encounters with machinic creativity, that remind me, oh my gosh, this is an entirely different way of just being in the world, that is not actually a tool for me, right? It's an encounter with something that it could be a partner in community, I think, as you're saying, Joy. And I wonder how we disrupt this relationship to things, the earth, machines, others. How do we disrupt this instrumentality in ways that offer us more chance for this connectivity? And Jacob, it sounds like the work you're doing with some of these communities is in that direction. Like, how do we together learn some of these skills?
I think so, yeah. And this is where thinking about cyberpunk and cyberpunk spirituality and themes of Joy you brought up, who's sacrificed. This is all part of a lot of thoughts in my mind. I'm trying to put them into order. This is why I've been recentering my work in disability studies as well, because you don't have that question of what's my relationship with the machine if I'm already mixed, if it's already me. And for the cyberpunk, which is this kind of imagined intensification, you get I've been completely devalued. I've already been sacrificed, or I know how ready society is to sacrifice me. So what kind of spiritual resistance and community comes out of that experience? And a lot of the participants in my ethnographic studies would identify with those themes. So yeah, what do you do in that hybridity of human and machine from this perspective of being down in the dirt, instead of somebody who's trying to go to Mars, live among the stars?
And I think we see this, thank you for that, Jacob. I think we see this in Afrofuturism around sort of thinking about the cyborg, and this history of non-human, and sort of, how Public Enemy talks about, Black communities in a way have been, in the apocalypse, for some time, but looking at those, sort of cyborg spaces or identity as a way of engaging in the transhuman beyond sort of these limitations of marginality, of vulnerabilities, et cetera, and sort of leaning into creating and recreating identity. And so that's a powerful piece of that, sort of what does it mean to lean into, again, technology as hybridity. But going back to, as I think going with Michael, what you're saying is that, sort of those religious experiences of the irreducible also speak to the ability to come in an authentic way and to move beyond that kind of instrumentality. And so that becomes, I think, the barrier for folks being able to sort of move beyond those dichotomies and those ways of seeing. But certainly, I think, Jacob, what you're talking about, Michael, what you're talking about is how do we center and foreground those experiences and those sites where people are actually engaging in this kind of connectivity and empathy and empowerment and hybridity in ways that enable us to see sort of new forms and new pathways for what we can lean into.
Joy, when you think about the connectivity you're talking about in the communities that you have been speaking about today, and kind of how the inorganic and organic are a part of that mix, right? Mm-hmm. Is that connectivity, how is that related to hybridity? I mean, is that a form of hybridity in a sense, where instead of, you also mentioned the I, we, and is the community in terms of identity, is it a hybrid thing? Whereas connectivity and hybridity, are they two really different things? Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Well, connectivity, in terms of how I'm speaking about, goes back to the efficacy. And so when you're talking about sort of the materials or the technology or identity and hybridity, however that shows up our interfaces, the point comes back to sort of the I-we collective in terms of, and again, I think this is sort of gets us beyond sort of the instrumentality and the transactional, is then how do we engage one another in connectivity in terms of how people show up. And so there are sort of ways in which people show up in social identities and in embodiness that are hybrid, but the way in which we relate, the way in which they are included in community speaks to this kind of connectivity and understanding of the I-we collective.
Thank you.
Jacob, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that question, on the difference between connectivity and hybridity, and the communities you study, where they stand in terms of how they would describe their relationship to tech.
Yeah, what I'm thinking about right now is the distinction between folks who are disabled and have a strong sense of what that means and what the experience of that is, and about how that shapes their experience of dependency also. Dependency on medications or technologies, an arm, a leg, for how they move and function in the world. And then people who don't have those experiences and are testing out different kinds of body modification. And there's a real distinction between somebody who has a dependency. So I'm thinking of research participants who rely upon a specific chemical that they need to take regularly to stay alive, and somebody who is fiddling around with a Fitbit and talks a big game about how they're a biohacker. These kinds of conversations get really dynamic in the communities that I study. Gillian Weiss introduced the term triborg as opposed to the cyborg. The cyborg is a disabled person. The triborg is a kind of poser or wannabe who partakes of an imagined romance of cyborg identity without the actual experience and what it's like to try to be cyborg in this world. So I'd say that the communities that really exhibit interconnectedness would be mindful of the distinctiveness of individuals' experience of hybridity within those communities. There's a lot of work to do around that. And I also think that it's really interesting how, from a religious studies perspective, what kinds of religious resources folks reach for in order to do some of that connecting work. And just to give an example from one of my communities, one of the anarchists who was making this birth control talked about an experience of spiritual abandonment being a key part of their motivation, that finding communities of care, communities of action, gave them the connectedness, the sense of interconnectedness that helped to heal some of that feeling of being spiritually abandoned. Whether or not that had anything to do with the fact that they had been an educator in higher education at one point, you know, we all have our own experiences of what it can be like to be connected or isolated working in this environment.
Jacob, I love the nuance that you just demonstrated for us in terms of what it means to be interconnected, sort of in the face of the ways in which people use technology. And again, that goes back to not just empathy, but the ability to acknowledge and recognize and listen in terms of how people articulate their identities, but also their practices and how they operate within that, and sort of in the room that the community makes for integrating these diverse identities and embodiedness into community. And so the recognition of sort of who, you know, is in this space and who's a poser and sort of, and the privilege and the social location around that, I think is a really important way to help us to think about what we need to pay attention to. And your language of mindfulness around that is really important in terms of connection and interconnection.
That's really wonderful, very affirming to hear. It's so nice talking with both of you.
I wonder if any of you, we've talked a bit about justice and healthcare and risk in terms of, you know, physical risk or risk to health, safety. These are some of the themes we've covered. I wonder about if any of you have thought about aesthetics and beauty in relationship to technology. This popped into my head, Joy, when you were talking about face recognition, because some issues I've been exploring recently in my work, which is very new, working with film. I learned recently that a lot of video tech actually is created to capture white skin beautifully to the detriment of brown and black people whose skin is not captured by the camera as clearly and beautifully as white skin. And the kind of technological innovations taking place right now by certain companies to try to create and market their cameras in a way that says, hey, we pick up all skin tones beautifully, not just white skin tones. And this is actually new. And so I wonder, you know, if any of you have also thought about various issues around aesthetics, beauty, and technology that's come
So
up.
I just saw the films Till and Black Panther Wakanda Forever last week, and it just reminded me of the time that we're in terms of the way in which dark-skinned Black people, in the case of Black and brown people, in the case of Black Panther 2, show up on film. And just going back to Julie Dash and Daughters of the Dust and the cinematographers who've been a part of that, as well as others who work around the sex. I mean, I remember going back to dating myself, but they still may be going back to school pictures. And I remember all the Black students standing around and our faces were just shiny and just didn't look like ourselves, and just the inability to be able to get good school pictures. And sort of the difference of seeing the ways in which, again, the diversity now sort of within filmmaking and the ways in which people have been pushing back and, sort of demanding greater, that the technology sort of really capture these kind of aesthetics is really critically important in terms of, beauty and aesthetics, but beauty and aesthetics within the context of the power of aesthetics in terms of what it means. I mean, those two films that I saw really dealt with grief and trauma. And so having the beauty, the depth and the beauty and the complexity of all of these people showing up in film in a way enabled. I went to see both those films with sponsored groups or with larger groups, and there was a way in which we all moved through the ritual of loss and grieving and trauma and celebration, and the technology and the aesthetics that came together to create that space for us, was incredibly important for folks to be able to move through those processes of grief and healing and celebration, and to look at that trauma, but also to move away from that in a way, sort of feeling collectively whole. And so those things are tremendously important in terms of how we move through, these spaces and communities. But as you said, it's just, so what'll be interesting to see in terms of now how it's marketed, looking at sort of this marketing, and we sort of come back to the instrumentality, sort of this, but, sort of the increasing availability will also allow people who are mindful and who do think about, the use of this kind of technologies in ways that connect and affirm and celebrate. But also, again, going back to the importance of ritual and embodiedness and intergenerational connection, as people are able to utilize these technologies and see themselves as they really are.
Yeah, it really struck me watching a commercial recently for a camera that markets itself in this way as capturing all skin tones beautifully, and thinking how fascinating that this huge corporation can so unapologetically acknowledge that they weren't doing this to begin with. It's just, it's so striking to me that the ways in which it was just, it's just been taken as a given that tech was created for white skin, and in terms of, around video and photography. And it for me, where it connects with some of the other things we've been talking about is around the lack of value neutrality when we're talking about tech and machines. We might, there's a lot of discourses where tech is assumed to be a good thing, a valuable thing, an ethical thing, something that serves justice or equity. Yet we know, like scholars of religion know, that religions aren't ethical, right? They can be put to either ethical or very unethical ends. Likewise with tech. And we can see that in these specific questions around race, aesthetics, disability.
Well, Andrea, I want to also say is though, what the other question is for the company to acknowledge the historical invisibility of particular communities in terms of how they've developed their technology and marketed it. You know, the question is, well, is there a reparative step that you actually need to make? I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, we have the technology, come buy it, but the acknowledgement that we have historically ignored and rendered particular communities invisible. Is it enough to just say, oh, we have it now, you can come buy it, to be repaired, to be actually reparative? Or, you know, does there need to be some other sort of ethical praxis related processes that are part of that now acknowledgement, and now you're marketing, you know, something to us that has, you know, because that being rendered invisible historically and being excluded historically has cost something, and you know, there's been a sacrifice in terms of that, in terms of communities being excluded. And oftentimes when those technologies show up, are they replacing other technologies that actually come out of these communities, you know, that have served in that gap? So those are some of the questions I would ask, is that, you know, sort of, and how sometimes these ideas or technologies are appropriated for profit for these larger companies and corporations, and then are they rendering invisible or marginalizing again smaller or grassroots companies and organizations and technologies that have been, you know, participating all along?
Joy, that's exactly what I've seen in all my field work all over the country, with small communities dedicated to technologies of healing or self-expression. Punk aesthetics and punk values are so closely linked. And there is an absolutely endless process of punk trying to stay one step ahead of commodification. I've been thinking for years now about all of these dynamics in terms of punks and profiteers, and the profiteers are just chasing as fast as possible behind any kind of community innovation, any kind of attempt to get ahead, to break free, to resist. It's always, the profiteers are always like, oh, okay, how can I make a buck off of this? But also, how can I neutralize the transformative potential coming out of these communities? I mean, some of the folks who got me started thinking in this direction were like the Lavender Panthers, you know, punks explicitly drawing on queer music and on Black politics to try to find some way to resist their neutralization within society.
I mean, I think that's really powerful to speak in this space, that the innovation, acknowledging sort of where the innovation actually is happening, but also the way in which that appropriation can neutralize. And, you know, and what happens is in those spaces is then, you know, these communities have to pivot and seek something that's been appropriated. They seek, you know, sort of another outlet, because then the neutralization of that becomes problematic in terms of sustaining that as something, you know, that can be healing and resistance sustaining. So, but those two words seem very significant in terms of the recognition of that innovation and where it's happening, and attempts at neutralizing it when it becomes someone who can profit from it out of capitalistic priorities.
I want to give us a chance to go to the questions, because I can see that everything everyone is saying is very generative, and we could talk among ourselves, but I want to give our audience a chance to pose some questions as well. So a question about how we imagine AI as a life form itself. Is this a question that you all have explored in the communities you study? In other words, at what point does society or a community value or acknowledge AI as a sentient life form? And then in that case, we've been talking about capitalism. And so this question could continue that thread. At what point then does AI become yet another exploited community or group or type of person that is exploited and put to the uses of capitalism?
Yeah, I think, thanks for the question. I find the sentience question a bit interesting because, again, I mean, what's the category of sentience built on, right? So when we think about AI or any machine or any thing that we engage, right, is sentience the sort of measure by which we want to decide on whether we value something a certain way? And is sentience defined as human sentience? Right? Is it human awareness? Is it human intelligence? Is it what is sentience in that sense? And so is our question about sentience reductive? Are we trying to reduce AI or machines or anything else into a category we already have so that we can hold it in a way that's really not actually useful going forwd? And so I wonder how we value things that are other, right? And start there rather than, okay, at what point does this become so much like me, I can value it like me, right? And then what do we do with that? Yeah, I just wonder if we can, I don't know if the sentience question, I know we talk about it a lot in the news, but I just wonder if that's, again, just trying to reduce another thing into a sort of normative sameness that isn't going to help us going forward.
That's so helpful for me, Michael, in my work on animals, because a lot of arguments coming out of animal ethics make similar cases for valuing and relating to non-human animals in ways that treat them, as Donna Haraway puts it, as significant others in their difference, not because they're like us, right? So that was really helpful how you connected that to thinking about tech. Thanks.
I would point the questioner to Beth Singler's work on Blessed by the Algorithm, for example, where people already treat AI as a significant entity and imagine it as shaping and influencing their life in religious ways, bestowing favors and blessings or curses and ill fortune. So whatever the calculative capacities of a given program or set of programs are, people's relationship to what they imagine AI to be is already pretty developed and dynamic out there, with people saying, like, I've been blessed by the algorithm, as Singler writes.
We also have a question connecting somewhat to some of the points Jacob made about disability. The question is, at what point do able-bodied people develop dependencies to technology? Is that something that can happen in our relationship to tech? Can we approach it not as people living with disabilities, but as people who had no disability, but then in relationship to tech developed dependencies? And maybe it could be more of a social question, social dependency, right? The person posing this question says, points out that we've created certain occupations where there's a dependency on tech just for somebody to basically be able to do their job?
I guess I'm having a hard time getting started on this one because I kind of hear like the question starts at, hey, this is about disability. Then what I hear is the question is about addiction, or it's about social conditions, such as like if you're gonna have a job, you need to work in this particular configuration. I'm thinking of like students who are told you can't take the final exam unless you have a laptop and you install a lockdown browser because we don't trust you. You have to meet those specific technical conditions in order to advance. I have to think about this some more.
On the latter part of it, we also have to think about addiction in a sense in terms of dependency, but also what have we abdicated in terms of that dependency? And again, how does that speak to interdependency, reciprocity, and mutuality? And so I think, again, going back to some of the words we use, mindfulness, efficacy versus efficiency and instrumentality, sort of how are we engaged? That's sort of the notion I'm saying about the I-we collective is that, what point do we sort of abdicate sort of our own participation and engagement in ways, and then the technology becomes the dependency in terms of how that gets done, and just I don't know if this is related, but I went on my morning walk to the creek and I was walking across the street and I had the right of way. But the person was looking down on their phone, and I said, I don't know if this person sees me in the world with this, 2,000 pound vehicle. But the sense of connectedness to that technology and the way it, permeates, sort of life in a way that disconnects us from other kinds of engagements and even our relationship with that technology and how, it can, in efficacious ways, operate in our lives. So that's what I think. I think sort of that also that speaks to our own development or lack of mindfulness or engagement in terms of those kinds of dependencies on technology when we're not thinking about what do we give up, what do we abdicate, what do we look away from because of those dependencies.
Thanks, Joy. I'm going to use your comments as a way to fold in another one of the questions in the Q&A, which was really more of a sort of comment or invitation for reflection than a question. But that somebody commented that tech can also support or facilitate forms of intimacy or connectedness. And so here we are right now on Zoom, connecting only because we have access to tech. And so especially since the pandemic, tech has been used in this way to facilitate forms of intimacy or connectedness. And so it can, again, we have this both and situation where tech can be both deeply harming, deeply liberating, deeply connecting, deeply disconnecting.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I was just talking about this with a colleague. I mean, in the ways in which we, through the pandemic and establishing apparatus than technology, where we can be more deeply engaged in our home life, in our family life, in our community. We don't have to always spend time traveling and deepening our footprint. One of my pastors at a church said, we will never come to church in a snowstorm again because we can just do it on Zoom. And so the ways in which technology enables us to make more space for our embodiedness in ways that make sense and keep us connected to people around us rather than disconnecting us, in these workspaces has been really an important thing. And for people who are, engaged in, entrepreneurial, independent, types of community work, technology has been something, I speak to a lot of Black women who, don't get pastorates or, work where that is, for which, they're paid. And so they built community through technology, which has been really important for them and their ministries and for the people who connect with them. So
talking about that complexity, Joy, and the moment of the driver and the pedestrian, that encounter that's where the phone is this wild card that we don't know, that person might be texting in a really intimate mode, right? Like they may be having a really intimate connection with somebody that they're texting. And that connection may be entirely reliant on their phone, if their loved one is perhaps very distant. But then they're also disconnected from the immediate social and the danger that they're posing by not paying attention to the road. And that helps to give me some perspective on the question that we had about dependency. So like, if you can't put down the phone because of this connection and focus on the people around you, that's very dangerous if you're driving. It's different if you're the passenger. I would say that could give us an idea of when it's a true dependency. If you can't put the phone down while you're driving. Because
sorry.
Oh, no, please. I was just going to say it just disrespects the people around you and endangers them.
Or that you don't feel like you can make a choice where if there's an intimate moment or a need that I have to respond to, that I don't feel like I can opt out of, sort of this, but, to pull over or I don't have to get there at that particular time. I can actually stop and do one thing and be intimate in this moment. This technology enables me to someone who's not here or who needs me in this moment, and we're not in, the same space. And so I think, again, that goes back to the larger way in which we're thinking about ourselves as embodied, connected beings in the world, and the ability to be mindful about those choices.
And there are different reasons to be dependent, right? Because you might be dependent because this is the only way you're going to connect with your loved one, or it might be your boss expecting an immediate reply, right? Doesn't matter where you are, if you're on the road, if you're with your kids, you are dependent on that tech to do your job, to respond to the boss man, whether it's on the weekends or in the evenings or whatever time. We are about out of time. So thank you for joining us. Thanks to our attendees and most of all to our participants. It's so lovely to connect with you all. And I was so grateful when you agreed to do this, because it was an opportunity. I already knew how spectacular you all were and have been lucky to be in conversation with you. But now it was an opportunity to share that with others. So thank you so much. Please click on the link provided in the chat to complete a short survey. After the webinar, you will also receive the link via email. And we'd really appreciate your thoughts and opinions so that the center can continue to work on making sure these conversations are useful and beneficial and excellent and all those good things. Stay tuned for the next Religion and episode, which is Religion and Mormon Studies on December 15th. And also, really importantly, the recording of this episode will be available on YouTube, probably in early December after the holiday, or after the Thanksgiving holiday. So thank you so much. It's a pleasure. And I'll see some of you all in Denver.
Thank you so much.